Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio was born in 1571 in the small town of Caravaggio, located in the Lombardy region of northern Italy. The town's name would later become synonymous with the artist himself, eclipsing his given name in fame and historical reference. His birth took place during a period of significant upheaval in Italy, marked by the Counter-Reformation and outbreaks of plague that devastated the region. Caravaggio's early environment was one of contrast. Deeply religious, yet politically unstable, both cultured and perilously unpredictable. Caravaggio was born into a family of modest means, but notable connections. His father, Fermo Merisi, worked as an architect and decorator for the Marchesi of Caravaggio, placing the family within the orbit of the minor nobility. This proximity to aristocratic circles likely offered Caravaggio early exposure to art and architecture, even if indirectly. However, the security this connection provided was short-lived. In 1576, when Caravaggio was just 5 years old, the plague swept through Milan and its environs, claiming the lives of his father, grandfather, and eventually his mother as well. The loss of his parents at such a formative age left a profound mark on the young Michelangelo. Orphaned by the age of 13, he was forced to confront instability and mortality firsthand, experiences that would later find expression in the dark, emotional intensity of his paintings. The trauma of his early years did not soften him. Rather, it seems to have hardened his character, contributing to the rebellious and impulsive behavior that would later become legendary. At age 13, Caravaggio began an apprenticeship with Simone Peterzano, a painter in Milan who had once studied under the great Titian. Though Peterzano was not considered a revolutionary artist, his studio provided Caravaggio with a solid technical foundation and access to the artistic currents of northern Italy. Under Peterzano's tutelage, Caravaggio would have learned traditional techniques of drawing, composition, and fresco painting, as well as the discipline necessary for mastering oil paints, a medium he would later wield with unorthodox brilliance. While in Milan, Caravaggio would also have encountered the stark, naturalistic style of Lombard painting, which emphasized emotional realism and detailed observation. This regional aesthetic contrasted sharply with the idealized figures popular in Roman and Florentine art. Caravaggio's later rejection of classical idealism in favor of raw, lifelike depictions of common people can be traced in part to these early influences in Lombardy. Even as a student, he demonstrated a proclivity for independent thought, often challenging conventions and resisting rigid artistic formulas. The Counter-Reformation also shaped the cultural and intellectual landscape in which Caravaggio matured. The Catholic Church, reeling from the Protestant Reformation, sought to reassert its authority through the arts, demanding emotional resonance and doctrinal clarity in religious imagery. Though Caravaggio would not align himself overtly with religious institutions, his future work would embody many of the Counter-Reformation's artistic goals: visceral immediacy, moral urgency, and direct engagement with the viewer. Little is documented about Caravaggio's personal behavior during these formative years, but even early on, he seems to have exhibited signs of defiance and nonconformity. He was reportedly difficult to manage and prone to bursts of temper, traits that would continue to define his adult life. Whether these tendencies were innate or the result of early trauma remains uncertain, but they formed a temperament that was at odds with the conservative values of his time. When his apprenticeship ended around 1588, Caravaggio likely faced a crossroads. Milan, though important, could not offer the same opportunities as Rome, the epicenter of artistic patronage in Italy. It is believed that after a brief return to his hometown, Caravaggio set his sights on Rome, a city that promised both possibility and peril. His decision to leave behind the familiar in pursuit of ambition reflects not only confidence in his talent, but a restless spirit unwilling to be confined by provincial boundaries. Caravaggio's formative years, though marked by tragedy and loss, instilled in him a complex inner world and a heightened sensitivity to the human condition. These qualities would become hallmarks of his mature work, particularly his focus on suffering, redemption, and the fragility of life. The death of his family, exposure to illness and instability, and a rigorous yet imperfect education all served as crucibles in which his artistic identity began to form. The city of Milan, veiled in the damp mist of the Lombard plains, was a place of both grandeur and contradiction in the late 16th century. Its Gothic cathedral pierced the gray skies with spires that shimmered under occasional sunlight, while narrow alleys twisted through neighborhoods echoing with the sounds of merchants, craftsmen, and apprentices. Within this vibrant yet turbulent metropolis, a teenage Caravaggio took his first formal steps into the world of art, apprenticing in the workshop of Simone Peterzano. Peterzano's studio was tucked within a district frequented by guilds and workshops, an enclave where the scent of turpentine mingled with the cries of vendors and the clamor of workshops. Inside, the walls were lined with canvases in various stages of completion. Saints in flowing robes, mythological figures posed mid-action, angels with smooth faces and golden curls. It was a place of repetition and discipline, where brushstrokes were refined through labor, not inspiration. For a restless soul like Caravaggio, it was both sanctuary and prison. The workshop itself pulsed with the rhythm of daily routine. Apprentices ground pigments into colored powders, mixed oils, prepared canvases, and practiced drawing from plaster casts of ancient sculptures. The master, Peterzano, would oversee their work with critical eyes, correcting proportion, guiding hand movements, and upholding the traditions of Venetian colorism and Mannerist elegance. To the young Caravaggio, who viewed the world through a darker and more defiant lens, this environment was both educational and constraining. Beyond the workshop walls, Milan's artistic heritage offered fertile ground for inspiration. The city still bore the imprint of Leonardo da Vinci, whose Last Supper in the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie drew pilgrims and painters alike. The churches and palaces of Milan housed frescoes and altarpieces steeped in the solemnity of the Lombard tradition, grim-faced saints, earthy landscapes, and unflinching expressions of piety. Caravaggio wandered these spaces, absorbing their weight, not with reverence, but with curiosity and critique. He studied figures not for their grace, but for their flaws. He noticed how peasants in the streets carried themselves with more sincerity than any marble Apollo, how a beggar's hand reaching for alms conveyed more pathos than the draped arm of a mythological nymph. Though still young, he began to sketch these common people in secret, testing the limits of what was considered worthy of art. In back rooms and alleyways, his drawings captured the grime under fingernails, the weariness of faces untouched by privilege. The city's pulse was not only artistic, but political. Spanish rule held sway over Milan, and soldiers in foreign uniforms patrolled the city gates. Public executions and religious processions were common sights, blending discipline with spectacle. The church loomed over all, promoting piety while watching for heresy. In this charged atmosphere, Caravaggio's growing sense of rebellion found fuel. The rituals of order, be they artistic or societal, seemed artificial to him, detached from the raw truth he saw in everyday life. By the end of his apprenticeship, Caravaggio had mastered the mechanics of painting, but not its orthodoxy. He had learned to build compositions, mix light and shadow, and render flesh with astonishing realism. Yet there was something simmering beneath his studies, a desire to tear down the wall between the sacred and the profane, to reveal the divine not in idealized beauty, but in sweat, pain, and human imperfection. This desire could not be fully realized in the confines of a traditional studio. Once freed from Peterzano's instruction, Caravaggio did not remain in Milan long. The city had taught him skills, but not freedom. He drifted briefly. Some say he returned to Caravaggio, others that he roamed northern Italy, but his sights were already set on something greater. Rome called to him like a distant storm. It was the epicenter of power, culture, and ambition, a place where an artist might rise swiftly or fall spectacularly. For Caravaggio, it promised not only patrons and commissions, but a stage worthy of his defiance. Before departing, he carried with him a sketchbook filled with studies, some proper, some subversive. He had drawn saints and sinners, nobles and beggars, all with the same unflinching hand. He had internalized the tools of his craft, but rejected the tidy lies that so often clothed it. His art, even at this early stage, bore the marks of contradiction. Beauty formed from brutality, holiness framed by the mundane, and emotion that simmered just beneath the surface. As he left the northern plains and turned toward Rome, Caravaggio was no longer merely an apprentice. He was a young artist forged in the narrow alleys of Milan, tempered by its contradictions and driven by a hunger for something that conventional art could not satisfy. The city had shaped his hands. The world beyond would shape his vision. When Caravaggio arrived in Rome in the early 1590s, the city was a paradox in marble and mortar. Its ancient ruins whispered of past empires, while its churches stood as monuments to a reborn Catholic faith, more assertive and theatrical in the face of the Protestant threat. Rome was a city in transformation, gritty and glorious, overflowing with sacred splendor and street filth alike. For an ambitious and proven painter, it offered both peril and promise. Caravaggio entered this world not as a celebrated artist, but as a wandering laborer with little more than a portfolio and an unorthodox vision. He had no workshop, no patrons, and no reputation. In the sprawling Roman districts teeming with foreigners, apprentices, and day workers, he scraped together a meager existence. He painted still lives, baskets of fruit, bowls of flowers, and anonymous figures with vacant stares, for low prices and even lower recognition. These early works, often overlooked, already bore signs of his later genius: dramatic lighting, tactile realism, and a refusal to idealize. He moved through a series of modest studios, sometimes sharing cramped rooms with other struggling artists. He frequented taverns and back alleys, places where the shadows were as dense as the city's political intrigue. But despite the instability, Caravaggio began to attract attention, not through grand commissions, but through whispers, of a painter who portrayed fruit with such precision that it seemed to rot on the canvas, of a man who painted saints like beggars and angels like prostitutes. His fortunes shifted when he entered the workshop of Giuseppe Cesari, a favored artist of Pope Clement VIII. Cesari's studio, known for its glossy, mannerist style and high-profile commissions, was a world apart from Caravaggio's gritty realism. But Caravaggio was employed to paint backgrounds and still lives, giving him the chance to observe elite artistic circles up close. Though he chafed under the constraints of Cesari's refined aesthetic, he also gained valuable exposure to patrons, materials, and the mechanisms of success. It was during this time that Caravaggio painted Boy with a Basket of Fruit and The Fortune Teller, works that, while seemingly innocuous, disrupted expectations. In them, beauty and deceit mingled. The subjects were drawn from life, their gazes direct, their expressions ambiguous. There was no theatrical pose, no polished finish. Instead, Caravaggio captured the awkwardness of real bodies and the subtle play of emotion on ordinary faces. These were not academic exercises. They were quiet challenges to everything Rome expected from art. The pivotal moment came when Caravaggio crossed paths with Cardinal Francesco del Monte, a refined and powerful patron with a keen eye for artistic innovation. Del Monte was captivated by Caravaggio's ability to breathe life into canvas and invited him to reside in his palazzo. There, among musicians, scholars, and courtiers, Caravaggio's status began to rise. The palace became his sanctuary and stage, a place where his work could evolve under the protection of one of Rome's most influential men. Under Del Monte's patronage, Caravaggio painted works that startled and seduced in equal measure. The musicians, Bacchus, and St. Francis in Ecstasy revealed his growing mastery of light, texture, and psychological nuance. He portrayed mythological and religious subjects not with distant grandeur, but with intimacy. His figures leaned toward the viewer, their eyes catching the light, just as their humanity was laid bare. These paintings were not sermons in oil. They were human confessions. Rome took notice. The streets echoed with the name Caravaggio, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in scandal. Critics were divided. Some praised his honesty, others accused him of vulgarity. But regardless of opinion, no one could ignore him. His canvases disrupted the visual language of Rome. In an age of graceful artifice, Caravaggio introduced something raw and unfiltered. He made the divine touchable, the holy fallible, the beautiful haunting. As commissions increased, so did the stakes. Caravaggio no longer painted for coins in a tavern. He painted for chapels and altarpieces. The church, while powerful, was not immune to the allure of his visual drama. And yet, with every new success, Caravaggio grew bolder, less restrained. He pushed subjects closer to the edge of acceptability. Saints bore dirt under their fingernails. Madonnas looked like common women. Blood, bruises, and sorrow replaced golden halos and clouded cherubs. In these early years in Rome, Caravaggio rose not because he conformed, but because he confronted. He did not charm the city. He challenged it, seduced it, and unsettled it. Rome, a city built on spectacle and sanctity, found in him a mirror it was not prepared to face. And Caravaggio, still in his 20s, had only just begun. Inside the dimly lit chapels and palaces of Rome, a revolution was brewing, not in the streets, but on the walls. It began not with manifestos, but with shadows. Caravaggio, by now a rising name among Roman patrons, was no longer content with merely painting lifelike figures. He sought something deeper, something elemental, a new way to see the divine. It would come to be known as chiaroscuro, a technique of intense contrast between light and dark. But in Caravaggio's hands, it was more than technique. It was theology, theater, and truth. His studio became a sort of laboratory of shadows, often illuminated only by a high, narrow window. The room was steeped in darkness, pierced only by shafts of light that fell like divine judgment. He would position his models, a peasant, a street boy, a courtesan, beneath these rays, letting their faces emerge from the gloom with startling immediacy. This light was not soft or heavenly. It was harsh, directional, and unforgiving. It exposed flaws, wrinkles, bruises, and fears. It made ordinary people look monumental, and saints disturbingly human. Caravaggio's fascination with light wasn't just aesthetic, it was psychological. He understood how light shaped not only forms, but emotions. A raised hand, half illuminated, became a plea or a warning. A face lit from below suggested temptation or revelation. Shadows hinted at what was hidden, suppressed, or divine. In his paintings, illumination was not neutral, it was narrative. It told stories before a single brushstroke described a face. The turning point came when Caravaggio received a commission for the Contarelli Chapel in San Luigi dei Francesi. The chapel was to honor St. Matthew, and it required 3 paintings. With this opportunity, Caravaggio set aside the decorum of religious art and poured his new language of light and darkness into the sacred setting. What emerged was the Calling of St. Matthew, a painting unlike anything Rome had seen. In it, Christ does not stand radiant and central. He enters from the side, almost unnoticed, a sliver of light trailing from his finger. The room is a smoky tavern. The men at the table wear contemporary clothing, oblivious to their moment of destiny. The gesture that recalls Michelangelo's creation of Adam is buried in shadow, offered not to a hero, but to a tax collector. Holiness, in Caravaggio's world, arrives unannounced. It looks like an accident. It interrupts the mundane. The second painting, The Martyrdom of St. Matthew, was more chaotic, filled with motion and panic. The saint falls under the assassin's blade, his hand reaching upward as if grasping at a heaven barely implied. Figures flee in all directions. There is no symmetry, no divine order, only violence, confusion, and a sliver of hope framed in flame-like illumination. Caravaggio's brush created not scenes of transcendence, but encounters, sudden, brutal, miraculous. With these works, Caravaggio redefined religious painting. He discarded celestial idealism and replaced it with realism soaked in metaphor. His saints looked like the poor because they were the poor. His sinners were not faceless, they were painfully specific. He insisted that the sacred could be seen in the everyday, that grace could descend not in gold leaf, but in a shaft of light across a dusty floor. His methods unsettled many. Church officials, used to polished visions of paradise, debated his choices. Some were scandalized by the vulgarity of his models, whom they recognized from the streets. Others were mesmerized by the emotional clarity, the visual urgency. Patrons whispered of his genius. Critics questioned his reverence. Yet his name continued to circulate, whispered in admiration and disdain alike. Behind the canvases, Caravaggio became increasingly obsessive with control over light. He would darken rooms for hours, adjusting single candles and shutters. He began to see the world as a series of illuminated moments, sudden glimpses of truth torn from shadow. Even in his personal life, light became symbolic. He dined by lamplight, walked after sunset, painted in silence pierced only by the creak of wood and breath of models shifting in the cold. In this period, Caravaggio did more than master a technique. He changed the relationship between art and reality. Through chiaroscuro, he allowed viewers not just to observe holiness, but to feel its intrusion. His light was not only visual, it was moral, emotional, and existential. With each new canvas, he challenged the boundaries of what could be shown and how deeply it could be felt. As Caravaggio's fame spread through the winding streets and echoing cathedrals of Rome, so too did the murmurs of outrage. With every new commission, his brush stirred not only wonder but controversy. The sacred spaces that housed his altarpieces were soon also home to whispers, priests questioning the propriety of his choices, patrons debating his defiance. Caravaggio, whose realism defied convention, was about to collide head-on with the dogma he had so far only circled. The first significant clash came with the death of the Virgin, a painting commissioned for the Carmelite Church of Santa Maria della Scala. It was meant to depict the Virgin Mary's peaceful passing, a moment the church held as sacred, serene, and dignified. But when the curtain was pulled back and the painting revealed, the outcry was immediate. Mary did not float on a cloud, nor were the celestial robes of heaven. She lay sprawled on a bare mattress, her feet swollen, her limbs heavy with death. Her face, pale and unidealized, looked not like a queen of heaven, but a woman who had known suffering. The church rejected it instantly. Rumors swirled that Caravaggio had used the corpse of a drowned prostitute as his model. Whether true or not, the scandal stuck, cementing his reputation as a provocateur. For Caravaggio, truth came before taste. Death was not a pageant to be dressed up. It was flesh, final and unromantic. In his vision, even the Virgin was not spared the gravity of human suffering. To him, this was reverence, truthful, painful reverence. But to the religious elite, it was an affront. Another scandal erupted with Madonna di Loreto, a commission for the Church of Sant'Agostino. In this painting, the Virgin appears barefoot at the doorway of a modest Roman house, holding the Christ child. Two kneeling peasants, wrinkled, dusty, with calloused feet, pray before her in wonder. There were no cherubs, no glowing halos, no architectural grandeur. Instead, the divine visitation occurred in the realm of the poor. This painting, too, sparked debate. Some praised its humility, but others recoiled at the idea of the Virgin standing barefoot on a dirt threshold, surrounded by commoners. Caravaggio's approach unsettled because it pierced comfort. His sacred figures bore the weight of the world, not its illusions. Viewers accustomed to gilded altarpieces were now face to face with their own mortality, their own humanity, mirrored in saints and martyrs who looked like neighbors or beggars. His work demanded not awe from a distance, but confrontation. One could not simply admire, one had to feel. In St. Matthew and the Angel, another storm brewed. Caravaggio's original version showed Matthew as an elderly, humble man, clearly struggling to write the gospel, while a youthful angel guided his hand. But the angel was too physical, too close, too human. The church deemed it unfit. The painting was rejected, and Caravaggio was forced to produce a second version, more composed, more ethereal, and far less intimate. Even so, the earlier work whispered of his desire to narrow the gap between heaven and earth. These repeated clashes painted a portrait of an artist in constant tension, not just with the church, but with the entire tradition of idealized spirituality. Caravaggio believed the sacred was most powerful when shown as fragile, flawed, and within reach. To him, the human experience was not separate from the divine. It was the stage on which the divine most clearly revealed itself. Despite, or perhaps because of, these scandals, his reputation continued to grow. Collectors vied for his paintings, aware that with each new work came the chance to witness something both raw and revolutionary. Caravaggio had, by now, become not just a painter, but a symbol of rebellion in the art world. He refused to flatter his subjects or shield viewers from discomfort. In a time of religious reform and control, he practiced a radical visual honesty. Behind the scenes, Caravaggio's behavior only added to the myth. His temper was notorious. He quarreled with patrons, insulted rivals, and got into fights with little provocation. Some called him dangerous, others unhinged. But even those who feared him could not deny his brilliance. It was as if the same fire that burned in his art also consumed him in life, driving him to take risks that others would not dare. In the heart of Catholic Rome, Caravaggio's paintings stood like silent protests. They defied the sanitized grandeur of ecclesiastical decorum. They told viewers, the divine is not distant. It is here, in the bloodied martyr, in the barefoot pilgrim, in the tired virgin. His scandals were not just personal. They were artistic declarations, and they were far from over. The more Caravaggio's star ascended in the artistic firmament of Rome, the more his shadow lengthened behind him. He was no longer the struggling painter sleeping among brushes and canvases. He was a man of means, with patrons in high places and commissions that lined church walls. But with that rise came an unraveling. Fame did not temper Caravaggio. It exposed the rawness at his core. His life, like his paintings, turned increasingly dark, drenched in conflict and driven by intensity that brooked no compromise. The artist's days grew erratic. He wandered the city with a sword at his side and a temper on edge. The courts of Rome began to recognize his name, not from frescoes or altarpieces, but from arrest warrants. Brawls, insults, accusations. His offenses piled up like broken wine jugs in the alleys he frequented. He was fined for carrying illegal weapons, charged with assault over trivial arguments, and detained for defacing property. His enemies multiplied, many with bruises or wounded pride as proof of their encounters. Yet amid this chaos, Caravaggio continued to paint with feverish devotion. His works grew darker in tone and more intense in emotion. In Judith beheading Holofernes, he captured a moment of grotesque violence. The blade halfway through flesh. The victim's face contorted in agony. The executioner, young and poised, is as disturbed by her action as the viewer. The contrast of beauty and brutality is almost unbearable. Caravaggio was no longer simply using chiaroscuro to illuminate scenes. He was now dissecting the soul with it. Violence became more than subject matter. It was his language. In David with the head of Goliath, the severed head bears Caravaggio's own likeness. The boy does not rejoice in victory, but looks down with a mixture of sadness and pity. The painting is not triumphal, it is confessional. It whispers of remorse, of recognition, of guilt. The blade that separates victim from executioner in his art had begun to blur in life. The breaking point came in May of 1606, when an argument erupted on a tennis court in the Campo Marzio district. The details remain shrouded in ambiguity. Some say it was over a gambling debt, others a woman. but what is known is that blades were drawn, and Caravaggio killed a man named Ranuccio Tomasoni. This was not a scuffle, it was murder. Blood stained the earth, and Caravaggio's fate changed irrevocably. Within hours, the artist was on the run. Rome, once his canvas and battleground, was now a city of ghosts and pursuers. The Pope issued a bando capitale, a capital sentence. Anyone could kill him and be rewarded. Caravaggio was no longer a scandalous genius. He was a fugitive. His self-portraits from this period, scarce as they are, show a gaunter face, hollowed eyes, and the paranoia of a man hunted by law and by his own mind. He fled south, moving through Naples, Malta, and Sicily, always with a trail of rumors in his wake. In each city, he left behind a painting, a duel, or a debt. Even in exile, commissions found him. He painted as though trying to atone with every stroke. His works from this period, the 7 Works of Mercy, beheading of St. John the Baptist, the burial of St. Lucy, bear a rawness that transcends mastery. They are imbued with desperation, a desire not just to paint the divine, but to be forgiven by it. Still, even his exile was turbulent. In Malta, after earning favor with the Knights of St. John and being made a knight himself, Caravaggio was soon imprisoned for another violent offense, perhaps a brawl, perhaps an assault. He escaped dramatically, reportedly through a rooftop window, and once again vanished into the night. The knighthood was revoked. His name was crossed from the roll of honor and written instead into the criminal ledgers of Europe. In these final wandering years, Caravaggio was a man divided, respected as a genius, reviled as a criminal. He painted images of martyrdom while creating new ones in life. His art became more anguished, his brushstrokes more urgent. Where once he illuminated saints with heavenly light, now he wrapped them in shadow, revealing their pain rather than their glory. His figures seemed to ask, not for veneration, but for understanding. The brushes and the blade had become inseparable in Caravaggio's world. His life was no longer a tale of rising talent, but a fugue of flight and fury. Each painting seemed to pulse with his own turbulence, a man desperately trying to wrest meaning from chaos, divinity from violence, and absolution from the edge of a dagger. The sea became both refuge and barrier as Caravaggio drifted further from Rome, the city that had once baptized his genius and then condemned him to death. A fugitive in every port, he arrived in Naples in late 1606, disheveled and exhausted. But Naples, with its crumbling palaces and thickly peopled streets, embraced him like a long-lost brother. It was a city ruled by passion and spectacle, qualities Caravaggio knew intimately. In this southern kingdom, he found not just safety, but a mirror of his own chaotic soul. Naples pulsed with the rhythm of barrows and bells, processions and poverty. It was a city unpolished, raw in its devotions and indulgences. Here, Caravaggio's style did not shock, it resonated. His first major work in exile, the 7 Works of Mercy, was commissioned by the charitable Pio Monte della Misericordia. In it, Caravaggio wove multiple acts of kindness into one crowded, moonlit alley. A man is buried, a pilgrim receives shelter, a prisoner is comforted, all illuminated by an angel's sudden appearance, bursting through a cloud of chiaroscuro. The work buzzes with movement, a tapestry of compassion born in desperation. In Naples, his technique took on a darker vibrancy. He had begun painting more rapidly, sometimes with only a few preparatory sketches, relying on instinct and the intensity of live observation. The figures grew more sculptural, their gestures sharper, their emotions unfiltered. Painters from all over Italy traveled to see his works, and soon, a Neapolitan school of Caravaggisti emerged, artists deeply inspired by his raw realism and dramatic lighting. His legacy, though still living, was already echoing beyond him. But safety was an illusion. One night in 1609, Caravaggio was ambushed in the street, attacked by unknown assailants. The motive remains unclear: vengeance, rivalry, or simple street violence. But the injuries were severe. His face was disfigured, and for weeks he hovered between fever and madness. Even his closest supporters feared he would not recover. When he did, he was changed. His self-portraits from this period show not the proud youth of Rome, but a haunted man, etched by fear, survival, and the lingering threat of death. Seeking both protection and absolution, he sailed to Malta, the austere island fortress of the Knights of St. John. There, discipline and secrecy ruled. Caravaggio, ever volatile, attempted to conform. He painted the beheading of St. John the Baptist, a monumental canvas that became his largest known work. The execution is subdued, yet chilling, the victim's blood pooling quietly, the onlookers subdued in horror. For the first time, Caravaggio signed his name, F. Michelangelo, in the crimson stream of blood. It was both a signature and a confession. The knights were impressed by his work, and in an unprecedented move, they made him a knight. But Caravaggio's temperament could not remain caged by ritual. Within months, he was imprisoned for another offense. The details lost to time, but speculated to be violent. He escaped, fleeing the fortified walls like a character from one of his own paintings. Half saint, half outlaw. He headed for Sicily, the last uncharted corner of his exile. Sicily, with its weathered stone and relentless sun, offered no refuge from memory. In Palermo, Syracuse, and Messina, he continued to paint. His burial of St. Lucy, executed in Syracuse, unfolds in murky silence. The martyr's body lies limp as workers dig her grave by torchlight. The crowd watches, grief pressed into the folds of their cloaks and furrowed brows. In these works, there is no spectacle, only sorrow. Caravaggio was painting less for fame, more for exorcism. These Sicilian paintings are marked by a growing minimalism. The backgrounds darken further, the figures stand closer to the viewer, and the emotion intensifies. His compositions become like dreams, suspended in time, haunted by mortality. It is as if Caravaggio had begun painting directly from the well of his conscience. Each canvas feels like a whispered plea for mercy, addressed not to the church, but to something older and deeper, the human heart. News from Rome traveled slowly, but it reached his ears. Powerful allies were pushing for a papal pardon. With hope reignited, Caravaggio returned to Naples in 1610, preparing for the final leg of his journey, his return to the Eternal City. He had painted a David with the head of Goliath, intended as a gift to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, a peace offering wherein David is compassion itself, and Goliath wears Caravaggio's own face. It was his last great statement, an artist offering his sins in the form of a masterpiece. As he awaited safe passage north, he packed his belongings and sailed along the coast. But fate, once again, intervened. In the sun-scorched heat of Porto Ercole, alone and unwell, Caravaggio died under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was fever, others claimed revenge, poison, or a fatal mistake. No tomb bears his name. His body disappeared, like a figure swallowed by shadow. Caravaggio died with no monument, no mourners, and no final blessing. A vanishing as dramatic and unresolved as the life he led. But while his body disappeared into an unmarked grave, his legacy began to surge through the corridors of European art like a tide unleashed. It was not an immediate canonization. For years, his name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and caution, his reputation eclipsed by the violence of his life and the unsettling intensity of his work. Yet even as the art world tried to look away, Caravaggio's influence seeped into the very foundations of what painting could become. In the studios of Naples, where he had once found fleeting sanctuary, a generation of artists began to mimic his sharp contrasts and visceral realism. They studied the weight of his shadows, the direction of his light, and the rawness of his subjects. These were not mere followers, they were believers. Painters like Battistello Caracciolo and Artemisia Gentileschi carried his torch, adapting his methods to new narratives and audiences. Through them, Caravaggio's aesthetic spread like ink through water, darkening the visual language of Baroque art across southern Italy. But the reach did not stop at Naples. In the Spanish courts, Caravaggio's style was adopted with fervor. Artists such as Giuseppe de Ribera and later Francisco de Zurbarán absorbed his devotion to tenebrism, the dramatic interplay of light and darkness, to portray religious ecstasy and human suffering with new emotional depth. Even in far-off Flanders, the echoes of his technique found fertile ground. The young Peter Paul Rubens, though more theatrical and ornate in composition, incorporated Caravaggio's emotional immediacy into his altarpieces and mythological scenes. The Dutch Republic, too, felt his shadow. There, painters like Gerrit van Honthorst and Hendrik ter Bruggen, having studied in Rome, brought back Caravaggio's lessons to a Protestant audience hungry for art that spoke to the soul without the scaffolding of elaborate symbolism. Through their works, the dramatic lighting and psychological tension of Caravaggio entered homes, taverns, and city halls, spaces far from the Roman chapels where his scandalous altarpieces first sparked debate. Yet, even as his visual language spread, Caravaggio himself became something of a myth. For many years, he was remembered more as a cautionary tale than a cornerstone of artistic evolution. His name was whispered in the academies but seldom taught. Art historians, shaped by ideals of decorum and harmony, dismissed him as a genius undone by savagery, too erratic to be part of the classical lineage. It would take centuries before scholars began to fully understand and restore his place in the history of painting. The rediscovery came gradually, fueled by a changing appetite for truth in art. In the 20th century, critics and curators re-examined Caravaggio not as an aberration, but as a prophet of modernity. His raw, emotionally charged canvases resonated in a post-war world scarred by disillusionment. His saints and sinners, stripped of ornament and exposed in all their flawed humanity, felt more relevant than ever. Museums began to recover and attribute lost works, and exhibitions revealed the breadth of his influence. Caravaggio was not simply back, he was central. Film directors, writers, and choreographers found inspiration in his compositions. The tension between shadow and light, the theatrical immediacy of his scenes, and the psychological complexity of his characters became templates for modern storytelling. His visual language, once condemned as too real, was now celebrated for its honesty. Artists such as Pier Paolo Pasolini and Derek Jarman created cinematic tributes that reimagined Caravaggio not just as a painter, but as an archetype of the tortured visionary. Even theology began to reconsider his depictions. Where once church officials had rejected his paintings as sacrilegious, modern theologians and clergy saw a spiritual truth in his work. His Marys, Josephs, and Matthews were no longer seen as provocations, but as affirmations of a Christianity rooted in the human experience. Caravaggio had brought heaven down to earth, and now the earth returned the favor by lifting him back into the heavens of artistic reverence. Collectors and museums scrambled to acquire his works, driving interest to new heights. Paintings once dismissed or hidden were reevaluated, cleaned, and recontextualized. His masterpieces, scattered across churches and private holdings in Italy, France, Spain, and beyond, were reunited in landmark exhibitions. The world once again stood before the calling of St. Matthew, the Entombment, and Judith beheading Holofernes, but this time with awe unmarred by scandal. Time had allowed his genius to shine brighter than the shadows he painted. In the quiet rooms of museums and the hushed aisles of European churches, a new kind of encounter with Caravaggio began to unfold. No longer dismissed as a rogue painter of questionable morals, Caravaggio had become the subject of pilgrimage, not of faith, but of art. Visitors stood transfixed before his canvases, drawn not only to the drama of light and shadow, but to the aching humanity etched into every figure. The silence that enveloped these spectators was not passive. It was reverent, the silence of people beholding something they could not explain, only feel. By the early 21st century, the revival of Caravaggio's image reached full bloom. Major exhibitions in Rome, Milan, Paris, London, and Tokyo drew record crowds. His name, once lost to the margins of art history textbooks, now appeared in glowing gold letters on museum facades. Academic conferences were dedicated solely to his oeuvre, and new technologies allowed scholars to analyze his brushstrokes, pigments, and even the underdrawings beneath his final compositions. A deeper, more intimate knowledge of his technique was now possible, revealing just how deliberate his visual choices had been. The effect of this resurrection was more than scholarly. It was emotional. For modern viewers, Caravaggio's work provided a rare bridge between the past and the present. His figures were not locked in time. They were immediate, breathing, caught in moments of decision and despair. In the Supper at Emmaus, the startled recognition of Christ by his disciples radiates off the canvas, their gestures frozen in a flash of revelation. In the incredulity of St. Thomas, the viewer almost recoils as Thomas inserts his finger into Christ's wound. These were not representations of doctrine. They were experiences, intimate and unflinching. The dramatic power of Caravaggio's imagery also found new life through interdisciplinary interpretations. Psychologists examined his work through the lens of trauma and identity, while theologians discussed the radical empathy embedded in his religious scenes. Historians traced his models to the margins of society: prostitutes, beggars, prisoners, thus uncovering layers of social critique. Art was no longer the sole domain of beauty. It had become a tool for reflection and resistance. And Caravaggio had been using that tool centuries before others dared. One of the most intriguing aspects of this modern resurrection was the discovery of long-lost or misattributed works. With the aid of infrared reflectography, pigment analysis, and digital restoration, art historians began identifying previously overlooked paintings as potential Caravaggios. Some of these discoveries sparked international debates, as in the case of the Judith and Holofernes painting found in a Toulouse attic, igniting global curiosity and academic rivalry. Each possible attribution carried the thrill of unearthing a fragment of the man himself, another shard of his truth brought back to light. Beyond the canvas, Caravaggio's life and art inspired an entire ecosystem of contemporary creation. Writers published novels reimagining his inner world. Stage productions explored his turbulent relationships and moral contradictions. In cinema, filmmakers such as Derek Jarman turned his story into a visual poem, full of blood, beauty, and spiritual tension. His legacy was no longer confined to the gallery. It had infiltrated literature, film, theater, and digital media, each reinterpretation renewing the emotional resonance of his work. Technology offered yet another dimension to Caravaggio's revival. Virtual reality reconstructions of his churches allowed viewers around the world to experience his paintings in their original context. Digital exhibitions recreated the rooms and altars for which the canvases were intended, restoring the narrative flow and sacred tension lost in museum settings. The power of his chiaroscuro, once reliant on candlelight and architecture, now glowed from LED screens and immersive projections. His art, rooted in physical texture, found strange new life in digital pixels. Despite this global embrace, Caravaggio's work retained its unsettling core. Unlike many Renaissance and Baroque masters, whose subjects inspire awe through perfection, Caravaggio drew viewers into discomfort. His saints trembled, his virgins aged, his heroes suffered. The resurrection of his image, therefore, was not a sanitization. It was an acknowledgement of complexity. Audiences did not come to him for serenity. They came to confront something unresolved within themselves. This emotional immediacy made his works especially relevant in a modern world often fractured by doubt, conflict, and yearning. Viewers saw themselves not in the grandeur of his settings, but in the fragility of his subjects, the searching gaze, the bruised face, the uncertain gesture. Caravaggio had painted them centuries before they were born, yet they felt seen. His art, forged in an age of candlelight and plague, now illuminated the hearts of those living in the glow of smartphones and anxiety. The resurrection of Caravaggio's image, then, was not just a rediscovery of a forgotten master. It was a recognition of enduring humanity, fierce, flawed, and full of longing. His works became more than relics of Baroque brilliance. They became mirrors for the modern soul, refracting light through centuries of shadow. There's a strange quiet that follows the name Caravaggio. It is not the silence of reverence, nor of ignorance. It is the silence of tension. A tension between genius and destruction, between divine vision and human frailty, between light and the shadows it casts. This contrast, more than any single painting or biographical anecdote, defines his legacy. It is the force that shaped his art and the wound that never fully closed, making him not just an artist of his time, but a symbol for all time. Caravaggio's world was not one of peace or clarity. He lived at the jagged edge of a century racked by religious upheaval, political paranoia, and artistic rivalry. Yet while others sought refuge in order and harmony, Caravaggio turned to conflict as his muse. His contrasts were not merely visual. They were moral, emotional, spiritual. He found drama not in grandeur, but in the moment just before collapse. The widening eyes, the clench of a hand, the tremble of faith. Where others showed victory, he showed cost. His canvases, seen now through the lens of centuries, are more than visual compositions. They are meditations on duality. The sacred and the profane share space within the same frame, often inseparable. A martyr's ecstasy looks indistinguishable from a criminal's final gasp. A divine light falls across dirt-caked feet and wrinkled skin. In Caravaggio's universe, holiness was not above humanity. It was buried inside it, waiting to be discovered beneath layers of grime and fear. Perhaps it is this refusal to separate the sublime from the sinful that gives his work such modern resonance. He anticipated what would only become clearer in later centuries. The human beings are not static icons of virtue or vice, but shifting constellations of impulse and intent. His characters are never fixed in righteousness or damnation. They're caught in between, as if painted mid-confession. This liminality, this eternal in-between, makes his art endlessly interpretable, deeply alive. Caravaggio's technique, too, embodied this contrast. His brushwork, once thought crude by classical standards, now reveals a deliberate looseness that adds immediacy and vulnerability to his scenes. The softness of skin, the gleam of sweat, the glint of an eye, all emerge not from detailed finish, but from bold decisions made in real time. He painted with the urgency of someone who knew time was limited, and in doing so, infused every image with motion, breath, and blood. Yet his contrasts were not just within the canvas. They radiated from his life itself. Caravaggio walked the streets of Rome with both a dagger and a paintbrush, oscillating between altars and alleys, mercy and violence. He was honored by cardinals and hunted by authorities, a man who inspired awe and provoked fear. This unstable duality, rather than diminishing him, made his artistic voice unique, raw, impure, unpolished, and all the more human for it. His story, unlike many of his contemporaries, did not culminate in peace or permanence. There was no stately retirement, no frescoed tomb, no final commission sealing his legacy in comfort. His end was abrupt, his name nearly lost. And yet, like a figure emerging from shadow into light, he reappeared. His works endured, not because they promised beauty, but because they offered truth in its most complicated, contradictory form. Today, his influence exists not just in galleries and classrooms, but in the very way we perceive conflict and humanity in art. Every photograph that plays with darkness and illumination, every film that juxtaposes violence with tenderness, every novel that explores the sinner saint within us owes something to Caravaggio's vision. He did not just create images. He created a language of seeing. one that embraces contrast as a necessary lens through which to understand life. And so, his legacy remains suspended in the chiaroscuro he mastered, a legacy that is not light or dark, good or evil, but both. It lives in the flicker between candle and void, in the pause before revelation or ruin. Caravaggio does not offer closure. He offers confrontation. His paintings stare back at us with unflinching honesty, demanding not admiration, but recognition. In the end, Caravaggio's greatest subject was not Christ or saints or even suffering. It was contradiction. And in that contradiction, we find ourselves reflected not as ideals, but as we truly are, broken, beautiful, searching. In Caravaggio's eternal contrast, the human story continues to unfold.